So, good morning, everybody. Maybe in the beginning we shut the door. If it gets too warm, maybe we have to open it again. So, first question, as each week, do you have questions? Did you come across things you didn't understand when you looked at the slides again? Did you do some homework which you want to discuss? So, first, any questions towards the slides? I personally would expect some, because what we did last week, the proof of the sender anonymity scheme, the failed stop key generation variation within the DC network, and discussing about traps, it's all slightly complicated, so it's not the very easiest part of the lecture. So I would expect some questions.
I didn't understand how it works to find out who attacks, or who, if somebody sends some garbage messages, how we can find out who that is.
Okay, then this is, for example, one question I did expect, because it's a kind of complicated protocol, and maybe we have to go through it once again. And maybe you interrupt me if I'm doing it too fast or if I don't explain it thoroughly enough. So, I think this was the slide we had. First, let's get clear what the problem is. It's pretty clear we have a kind of channel which is additive. So if one station sends garbage, the sum is garbage, which is some kind of dual property to the sender anonymity. So if you have a system with sender anonymity, usually an anonymous sender can disturb others. And because by definition the sender is anonymous, it's not trivial to do something against that. Nevertheless, we would agree that in extreme circumstances, we would like to do something against it. One is availability. If disturbing the network means no useful use of the network anymore, then we have to do something against it. Or if it's not about disturbing the network, but misusing it, for example, you send a threatening message, I'm going to kill everybody who is interested in anonymity, then probably the anonymity geeks would like to know, oh, is this a joke or is this to be taken seriously? And if it's to be taken seriously, what can we do against it? So they would like to know who was the sender. Okay, so problem seems to be clear. And the tension between anonymity on the one hand, which shall be provided by the network, and traceability, that is finding out in extreme situation who did what. So this tension is clear as well, okay? So now it gets specific, because now we have to take into account what kind of anonymous network we are using, because the details of tracing people, laying traps, etc., 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 depends on the network. Okay. Maybe I go even a little bit back further. The problem we now have, this kind of tension, is under which circumstances do we allow that the message is traced. On the one hand, we would say it should be possible. On the other hand, having kind of anonymous network means you have some guarantee, if you well behave, that your message isn't traced. And again, this is a kind of tension. I spoke about this tension using the slide with the reservation blobs and told you, okay, a reservation can mean two things. A reservation can be a reservation for sending a useful message, for sending a message containing maybe personal information. Such a message we would like not to trace. With the exception, maybe if it's a threatening message, you would like to trace it just because of its personal content. But a personal message, usually, you wouldn't like to trace because the availability of the network is not as good as you would like it to be. So different kinds of reservations might partition the bandwidth of our network in a part which is used for sending private information. This part you should never trace for availability reasons. Maybe for reasons of the content transmitted, but not for availability reasons. And a part which is traps. Mainly just sent to get an attacker to fall into the trap, which means disturbing, trying to jam that message which corresponds to a reservation, which is a trap. Now it's pretty clear if you make a distinction between traps and non-traps. Someone has to be able to decide which is a trap and which is a non-trap. Who is going to decide that? Pretty clear. This should be the person who did the reservation. Because if this person relies on that that's a non-trap, then sending personal information, then he never ever would like it to be opened or handled as if it would be a trap. So one way to implement that is using for those reservations blobs. Those are commitment schemes which commit either to 0 or 1. And one of the two you define as being a trap, and the other you define as being a non-trap. And then a blob has a property that it can only be opened in one way. So the blob commits to trap or non-trap. And the blob can be opened by the party forming the blob. So the person laying a trap can decide to open the blob, demonstrating this is a trap, and asking, please trace. And if the person makes sure that the blob has the value non-trap, then he may be certain that nobody can open it. And in particular, nobody can open it as denoting this is a trap. So this was a slide making sure that in the distributed system, all honest stations agree on whether to trace or not to trace. And now we come to your question in the particular sense, if we decided to trace, how to do it. But before starting how to do it, it should be clear under what circumstance it has it to be done. And what is particularly important here is, given the information, given the protocol, given the agreement to all the procedures, if I can open a blob as a trap, and if I insist that because this is a trap and I want it to be traced, then we have a rule, everybody has to cooperate, tracing the corresponding message, the message which corresponds to this blob. And the rule is everybody has to cooperate. Which means if someone says, I don't, or I don't want to, or I can't, then this party is violating the protocol. So the starting point is we need a procedure which makes it absolutely clear to each honest station when to trace and when not. Because we want to be sure all honest stations agree, and a station which doesn't agree is a kind of attacker. Of course, so the procedure starts, or we say we want to trace, and now some procedure starts, what to do, and whenever a station doesn't cooperate in tracing, this station is considered as a kind of attacker. So next question is, what do we do with attackers? Of course, this depends. Why? Because even if you don't attack intentionally, maybe from time to time you make errors. I think this is pretty human. And I would even argue that computers in this respect are pretty human, because from time to time they make errors. Often they make different kinds of errors than humans, but they do. So, of course, we could discuss, hey, if we can detect that some computer misbehaved once, is this a good reason to say we are going to exclude you forever? I would say think twice before you do so, because it's commonplace that sooner or later a computer will malfunction. Maybe he's working fine for many years, but sometimes it will fail. Human beings, maybe you have a really honest person. He doesn't do errors, he doesn't do attacks for many, many years, but anybody will err sometimes. So is it a very clever idea to exclude that person on the first occasion when she or he errs, and this can be demonstrated? So, okay. So I assume, and I would assume, that we are only going to punish persons or computers if they err, if they are in error or even attacking too often. This kind of threshold I'm now going to ignore. I'm now going to pretend whenever someone errs, he has to be punished. But this is nothing than a short notation, a short wording for if someone exceeds some kind of threshold, he or she has to be punished. Or if a computer is malfunctioning too often, let's get rid of that computer. Okay, from now on, I will say if there is an error, we have to do something. Meaning, if some threshold is exceeded, we have to do something. Okay? So, what to do if you find a computer or a user in error? If it's pretty clear, it's this computer, it's this user, so what do? What can you do on the internet? It's really hard to send a police officer to that person because usually you have no clue under which jurisdiction this person lives and works. Often you don't know where it lives and works. In some sense, often you don't know whether there is a human being at all. You know, on the internet, nobody knows you are a dog. And putting a dog into prison is not really, let's say, commonplace. So what do you do in a distributed system? Probably you say, hey, if you have kind of identity, whatever identity might mean, it might be an IP address, this can be forged, surely. It can be a kind of public test key of a digital signature system. Whatever you have as an identity, you would say, all we can do is exclude that entity, which may not give us a good feeling that what happens is justice, because if this person really caused some damage, just excluding it may, from your feeling of justice, not be enough. But in some situations, you cannot do more. And often I would say, hey, if we form some kind of team for anonymous communication, then excluding a person who does not follow that goal is the best we can do. And in some sense, I even would say it's justified, it's okay. So the first rule is, if you can make clear that some human being or some computer did misbehave, we are going to exclude it. Which in the DC network might mean all keys with that person are deleted, and the local output of that person isn't added anymore. So this person may send on the internet whatever he likes, but the honest participants are going to ignore it. So what I'm not talking about is now distributed denial of service attacks on the internet. Of course, a person being angry about something could send enormous amounts of traffic, but this is something I'm going to ignore because this has nothing to do with the DC network. Depending on the network infrastructure, it still may be a problem, but it's not the problem I'm discussing now. Okay. So, what else could happen? We are not finding anybody where we can prove that entity misbehaved. How we check that, I'm coming to in a minute. But we find 2 or even more entities being in some kind of disagreement. Maybe disagreement can be about whether they exchanged the key or not, or what the value of the key exchanged is. the broadcast of the last round. Maybe they using the broadcast of last round or of the last rounds, plural, for generating the key of the current round. So it can easily happen in a distributed system that stations or users disagree. What do you do now? If you have disagreement, and if you take seriously this disagreement, what do you learn? You learn that those two entities will not trust each other anymore. So what do? You say, can we simplify our system on the assumption that those entities where we have disagreement don't trust each other? Because first, if they disagree, that they don't trust each other, I would argue this is just a fact of life. And secondly, if we can use that to simplify the system, sounds good. So what does simplify mean? In the DC network, it means if those entities share a key to provide sender anonymity, or in the fail-stop scheme to provide recipient anonymity, then let's delete the key. Because if they don't trust each other, if one considers the other as attacker, why should they share a key? So summing up until here, what do we have? If you are going to investigate and someone can be identified as breaking some rule, we are going to exclude it. Maybe that person does not cooperate in the investigation. Maybe that person makes statements which are self-contradictory. Or if you cannot identify someone who misbehaved, but you see that some entities have disagreement, so you know that at least one of them somehow misbehaves, then you say, okay, at least one of them is working against the commonly agreed rules. So in this sense, some of them is an attacker. So they don't trust each other. So let's use that for simplification. And in the DC network, this means deleting keys. Now I'm getting slightly more specific. If someone misbehaves, what options does he have to conceal that he misbehaved? This, of course, depends on what about that person is known. So maybe I should now start with a slide here. Assume you misbehaved. About which properties can you hope to successfully lie? Because if you just admit I misbehaved, it's pretty clear you are excluded. So you are looking for a way of arguing that what you did was okay, but maybe what others did wasn't okay. And of course, if you are lying and you are an attacker, I assume you're doing it in a clever way. So, about which facts is it impossible to lie? The output of the station. We assume that all outputs of all stations are known. In the proof of sender anonymity, we did assume that. Why? Because it was nice. It was a very, very safe assumption. We said, hey, we give the attacker a lot of information. We give all outputs of all stations to the attacker. So we are on the safe side. So this was a reason to do the proof like this. On the other hand, if we now want to trace who did what, and we know we did the proof that way, we could say, hey, now we want to make sure everybody knows everybody's output. How could we do that? For example, we could agree that each station is digitally signing each output. So signing output value, time, or round number. Okay. So we can well make sure that the output of the station cannot be changed or cannot be forged successfully after the fact. That is, we can make sure in a distributed system everybody knows all the outputs. If we make that sure, then of course lying about the output one did probably is not a successful strategy. Why? Because all honest stations within the system will say, hey, this person is lying. And by the way, this is a digital signature that this has been the value of this round. So it's obvious. This person, this station is lying. Let's exclude it. Okay? So this fact we can establish quite well. If we do a DC plus network, that is, if we want to use the broadcast value in the key generation, then we also have to check to make sure that we know all the global superposing results received by the station. Because those results might make a difference in the keys generated. So we have to know which results did the station receive. Can we establish that? The answer is, on principle, yes, because what is broadcast is public, so there's no requirement concerning confidentiality or secrecy. So we could publish that. How to publish that in a distributed system? Okay, if we go in the extreme situation, we do the same story as with the local outputs. We just ask each station for each round to sign the broadcast it got and publish that to everybody. Then, in case of an investigation, that station cannot change that, right? I'm not arguing that this is now pretty effective or efficient. And probably, as long as everything is fine, maybe we are not taking all those overheads. I'm now just going to the extreme case that we want to investigate and that we want to be prepared for an investigation. Okay, so the second kind of data, the global superposing results, can be, because they may be public, secured by digital signatures as well. So far I think we can do it, and maybe we should do it, whether there will be an investigation or not. Whether we do this until here is mainly a question, do we afford the expenses? It's not a question of sender or recipient anonymity. It doesn't deal with secret data. Okay? So until here, we would assume if we are well prepared, if we do all the digital signatures, it can be decided what happened. So if we now want to understand which station did send a message, in the sense of it doesn't send the neutral element within the group, but some different element, that means it really did send a message. What do we have to know? All the keys of that station. Why? Because the output of the station is the sum of all the keys plus the message. So if we can establish what was the output, we just discussed, we can. If in addition we can establish what are the key values, then we can calculate what was the message this station did send. In case of the DC+ network, we even need more. It's not enough to know all the keys, but in addition we have to know all the superposing results, because they are needed for the calculation of the particular key values. But we already discussed how to establish the superposing results. So how to establish the key values? One way to do it is ask, with whom did you share a key? And please, what has been the particular value of the key shared for the particular round? First part of the question, with whom did you share a key? How do we establish who shares keys with whom? We said the key graph, who shares keys with whom, is public or can be public. If we now want to investigate, we should not only say it can be public, we should say it should be public. It has to be public. Only then do we know how many keys that station had to add. Right? So again, we would argue that whenever you exchange a key with someone, you sign a message that you are exchanging a key with that entity. And maybe this message is published. This signed message is published. Okay, now we know with which stations with which other stations, the station we are just looking at, did exchange keys. Now we have to make sure we know the value of the keys. Not the whole key, but the value of the key for the relevant part of the key, right? So what do we do? Probably the first idea is asking the other station, knowing the key, what was the value? And of course asking the station as well, what was the value? If both stations agree, if the values they tell us are consistent, we would say, yes, we take it. If they are inconsistent, what do we know? One of the two, at least one of the two stations, is misbehaving. So we may well delete that key, because those two stations won't trust each other. One is misbehaving, so let's delete the key. If in our flow of investigation we come across a situation that we have to delete a key, then we delete it and just proceed. Not proceed with the investigation, but just restart the DC network and proceed. So in some sense, we agree that we are doing the investigation only until we find the first thing to do. First thing to do may be excluding a station, or maybe deleting a key. By the way, what do we do if we neither find a station to exclude nor a key to be deleted? That is, everything is fine. What should we do then? Then we should exclude the station requiring the investigation. Because what are we talking about? We are talking about preventing denial of service attacks by some kind of investigation. So this means if I start an investigation and it doesn't reveal a kind of attack, then starting the investigation is the kind of denial of service attack. So we should exclude that entity. So if you continue with this, and if we assume we have an attacker who wants to work against availability, what will happen? Okay, mainly there are two cases. One case is that our attacker is very, very stupid. Then probably quite early in the process, our attacker will do statements which are just self-contradictory. So, or he will admit that he did misbehave. So quite early in the game, we are going to exclude the attacker. If so, fine. Because if all stations being part in the DC network are honest, then we've got what we aimed at. If our attacker is more clever, which we should assume, because usually you shouldn't consider your enemies as being stupid, the attacker, which is jamming the network, that is, he's sending some messages, sending some non-neutral elements within the abelian group, when he or she shouldn't, the attacker will use keys exchanged with others to lie about whether he did send a neutral element or not. Because if he's changing the key value, he can argue, I did send the neutral element because I had this key value, right? But another entity, the entity he shared the key with, will say, no, you had, or we agreed to a different key value. And then we exclude a key, right? If we do so, and if we start with a limited number of keys, after a limited number of investigations, our attacker won't share any key with any honest station. Which now means for him end of the game. Why? Because it's pretty clear if you have a station, or maybe the attacker even has a set of stations which don't share keys with others, then in effect you have not one DC network, but at least two of them. So if you are up for sender anonymity and recipient anonymity, it just doesn't make sense to add all this stuff up. It's more efficient to say, hey, we take those stations which share keys and add it up, and the other stations which maybe have a different key graph, which is not connected to the first key graph, we take that separately. So we have two DC networks, which means the honest stations have excluded the attacking stations. And the attacking stations have their own DC network, where they may attack as long as they wish. Maybe nobody complains, because they are well organized. So they have lots of fun attacking each other all the day and enjoy that. I would say this is okay. If you enjoy that, do it. Maybe we may argue about electricity and energy consumption, and now get into a very green discussion. But if we exclude that for the moment, okay, they may do what they like. Of course, I should mention, just to give you a complete picture, things which haven't an effect, but I nevertheless should mention them. Of course, an attacker who has many stations could lie about key values within his stations. So he can, by transitivity, shift the conflict somewhere else. But sooner or later, either he will have a conflict with a honest station, or he will have a conflict in his stations. And in this case, he will lose a key as well. So the statement, the invariant, is whenever you jam, at the very least, you are losing a key. And if you are starting with a fixed set of keys, with a limited set of keys, losing a key whenever you attack means in the long run you haven't any keys. At least you haven't any keys which are valuable. Okay. So maybe I should just comment that part of the slide, which I more or less explained implicitly. It's pretty clear if you have the keys, the output of the stations, and superposed results, then you can calculate the message, whether it's a neutral element or not. If you know something about the access protocol, and in a DC network, everybody should know which access protocol we are using, what are the rules of the access protocol, then by comparing the calculated message character and following the protocol, knowing who is entitled to do what and when, you can see whether the station followed the access protocol. So this was a lengthy repeat about how to trace attackers. Is it now clear? Is it clear to everybody else? Please, if not, ask. We have time. And I think we all feel better if what I talk is really understood, then just let me talk and say, okay, let's ignore what he's saying It's hard to understand anyway. This is not a good procedure at the university.
Yeah, I do have some questions. First, in the reservation phase, why do we need two N slots? One reason I might have come up is, so if you could say, if I don't have anything to send, I use my slot as a trap. And so I will have traps and I will have messages and everything runs with one N. And the only downside may be that if I reveal a trap, I'm clearly not one of the ones sent an actual message. Is this the only reason or is there something else?
This, first, this is one of the reasons. And in addition, there's an additional reason. When I explained this frame, I argued until here, no personal information made it into the protocol. Because I argued, if I have two N slots, that is, each of the N participants does one reservation for a trap and a second reservation for a non-trap. So everybody does the same, absolutely static. So until here, no personal information, which means until here, whenever someone says, hey, we have a kind of attack, he can investigate everything. Everything means everything from here to there, because there's no personal information. If I would say I'm reducing it by a factor of 2, that is, I have only N reservations, and everybody decides whether to lay a trap or not, we have some kind of potentially personal information which makes it into that part. Because if I'm laying a trap, it means I have nothing to send. If I'm not laying a trap, this probably means I have something to send. And this gives me at least some information about the state of the station. Maybe it's not much, but I couldn't argue that it's none. And in the description of the protocol until here, in the original publication, we argued until here, we can trace everything without revealing any personal information. So this kind of invariant, this kind of statement wouldn't be true. Of course, I see the value in what you say. In the static fashion, it's pretty clear. I have to waste half of my resources just for the traps. And on the internet, everybody has in his mind best effort delivery, best effort performance. Be dynamic. Don't be static. Try to use it as good as you can, which of course means any static allocation of resources is something which computer scientists consider as a kind of sin. The price you pay if you go for more dynamics, this kind of behavior tells me something about your demands, your wishes, your cues. And in designing this protocol with my colleagues together, I took a very fundamentalistic point of view. Now, as a computer scientist, you would argue, hey, okay. How do we do that? Can we do better than this? And then I would say, yes, I would do it slightly different. But to admit it, I wouldn't do it in your way. I would say, hey, when I have a DC network, maybe 100 people starts to form a DC network. It's unclear whether within the 100 people we have an attacker. So probably signing all this stuff, laying traps, in many cases, it just would be overkill, right? So I would first start with a very optimistic protocol. Optimistic with respect to availability. I just omit all the traps. I would just maybe even omit all the digital signatures for making clear and committing to what was the output, what was the character received, etc. So get rid of everything you don't need absolutely. If it works, fine. If it doesn't work, then we know we have a kind of attacker. And then I would argue, and now we have to pay all the expenses I just described. I would allocate the resources in a static fashion, and that way force the attacker either in the long run to commit suicide or to follow the protocol. But I would start with an optimistic assumption: if there's no attack, then let's go for efficiency. And I would hope that, since the attacker knows that if he does disturb the more efficient variant, what can he achieve? He can achieve that if he participates, he brings down the efficiency by a factor of 2. But he has to participate to stay there. Doesn't sound like a splendid good deal. He cannot bring it to 0. He cannot really block it. So my hope would be that because we have a fallback strategy where we can, let's say, prevent attackers from modifying attacks, I would hope we never ever will see anything in reality, because attackers know if the user base, the user community gets fundamentalistic about it, then they won't have a chance in the long run. What I wouldn't do, and this is now a kind of maybe even religious statement about engineering, I wouldn't do the compromise deeply implemented into your system. So I would like to have a system which has several states. One is maybe an optimistic state. We have no security against this and that, but we know exactly what we have. And if we want to prevent kinds of attacks, then I would like to have a clear strategy. If I'm going to open up everything here, what does this mean? So in some sense, I would argue that my system design is, if I may be optimistic, of the same efficiency as yours. And if we are victim of massive attacks, then for some time, my approach will be less efficient than yours. But after some time, I have an opportunity to switch back to the more efficient way. And I have the clearer statement what kind of personal information may have made it to the attacker in the meantime. So this would be my kind of argument. I admit my way of viewing the world is not mainstream. I'm in some sense a security and privacy guy. And I'm very happy with best effort, something, best effort bandwidth, best effort timing. But if it comes to privacy, I'm slightly skeptical, and I'm arguing that best effort privacy or best effort security probably is not what we really need. And here I get a little bit religious. And for historical reasons, I would argue, whenever people build systems with the kind of best effort security, it was a nightmare. At least this is my perception. Of course, I would call, for example, the automatic teller machines of our banks a nightmare. And the banks would say, hey, it's a marvelous thing. We make a lot of money off it. And most people would say, hey, it's a nice thing. I get money whenever I like it, 24 hours, 7 days a week. And then I would say, hey, okay, you have been lucky. Nobody stood in your back and looked on your PIN input. Nobody managed to get your magnetic stripe card. You could be in a quite diverse situation. So I would argue a system which is a horrible system for 1 promille of the population probably isn't a really good system. But okay, again, this is a kind of religious statement. On average, you could argue it's nice. But on average, it's a very delicate argument. So just to tell a joke, let's assume you are shooting on some enemy. First, you shoot at the left side, then you shoot on the right side. And then you argue on average he's dead. It's ridiculous. Average in many situations is not what we are aiming at. Okay, so I hope the design principles are clear, what I made. It's pretty clear that what I made somehow is expensive. Yes. And if you say, okay, it's expensive and I've understood it, then I would say, yes, you have got the point. That's reality. Okay. Further questions?
Next question. The details of this laying trap thing. What message does a station has to send? What contains this message? And how does it has to encrypt or sign or whatever the message to get this property that no one can see it is a trap, and after the station reveals it, everyone can check it. How does this exactly work?
I have the feeling you are asking me 2 questions. I try to answer them one after the other. The first question is, let's assume we are running this kind of protocol. How can a station trigger some kind of investigation? And the answer is there are 2, let's say, commonly agreed points in time where everybody could ask for an investigation. One point is here. After the reservation phase, everybody could ask. And if someone asks, it has to be done. If it doesn't reveal any violation of the protocol, then the entity asking for it is the attacker, right? Here's the second point. Everybody can ask for it, but to get it done, the person asking for it, and asking for it now doesn't mean investigation of everything, but here it means investigation of a particular slot. Here it meant investigation of everything. Here it meant or it means investigation of a particular slot. And let's assume I am here one of the participants. I argue I want to have, for example, slot 2 to be investigated. Then it's pretty clear, everybody knows, the value of the reservation of slot 2. Here, this is a kind of bit string. Let's assume it's 1,000 bits. Just some value we did for reservation. And now I have to open this blob, this bit commitment, as a bit commitment which tells, hey, this is a trap. Because only then, here, this part will be investigated. And now the simplest way to describe a bit commitment in a cryptographical setting was a bit commitment is just the encryption of 0 or 1 in a probabilistic asymmetric encryption system. Why probabilistic? Because otherwise you could just try out the plain texts, 0 and 1. If it's probabilistic, it takes too much computational effort to break it, hopefully. How do you open such a blob, such a commitment? You just say, and this is a random number. How to check? You take the public key, the random number. Maybe you even tell them this was a trap, so the value 0 or 1 is known, which one. Then you encrypt it, meaning everybody does this, everybody encrypts that, and checks whether the outcome is the value here. If so, yes, this commitment has been opened successfully. Everybody has proof what the value is. And then if the value is this is a trap, we are going to open it here. We are going to investigate it here, right? If here I make a lot of fuss, I want slot 2 to be investigated, but then I can't give you information to open the commitment accordingly, then again, I'm an attacker. I'm just a person trying to stop or delay the procedure of the DC network. So you throw me out. Okay?
What sense does it make after the reservation blocks for investigation?
So your question is, what sense does it make to do investigation here?
Yeah, because did I get that right that the phase before that is just for reservation of slots? So I don't quite understand why you should investigate.
Okay. So what would you propose? You would say no need ever to investigate it, or? Okay, but maybe I shouldn't ask you how you would do it. I should argue, or should be able to argue, why I do it this way and why this is okay. An attacker, of course, could try to disturb the reservation phase. Just make sure it doesn't work out. I give you an example. I gave you this protocol, which was a quite efficient multi-access protocol. And if it works this way, it has a nice property that it brings those messages into a sequence. And as we designed the protocol, the sequence is just that we start with the smallest message, 1, 2, 5, 7, 15, right? So this works fine. So if this is the original set of messages sent and the protocol proceeds, then it delivers an ordered sequence of the messages, right? So this sounds like we can use it as a reservation scheme, this protocol as a reservation scheme, figuring out who is going to send when, right?
Okay, so if you use that as a reservation scheme, you could attack it by sending different messages each time.
Yes, so this is one attack, okay. But I would argue a more subtle attack is this. Your attack would mean that after I start it, then someone misbehaves here. And now if I would trace it, and meaning tracing means now tracing the whole thing, I would find out that a station did send a different message than it should have. So yes, if this kind of attack happens, we would find it out like you described it. Okay, maybe I should first make a pause here and say, yes, you are right. After the pause, I would say there's even a more subtle attack, which is harder to prevent, or which is, it's unclear whether it is to be prevented at all. Here, station 3 and 5 have the same message to send. The protocol here works out fine. It doesn't need more steps. All the messages are received. But this protocol will not enable us to determine whether then in the later sending phase, first S3 and then S5 should send, or vice versa. Because they are sending the same message, we don't get an ordering of those two messages because they are exactly the same. So you can't see this is this and that is that. And of course, if this happens by chance, what to do? Just repeat. Or an attacker, of course, could try not just let it happen by chance, because that longer bit strings are the same by chance. Okay, it's very, very improbable. An attacker could try to tap, oh, this was a bit string of one user. I'm going to take the same bit string. And so at least I'm very happy that until here, I really can trace everything as often as I like without conveying any personal information. This was the argument about the religious attitude to security and privacy we just had. And what to do? It's unclear in the sense that I don't remember exactly what we did write in the original paper about it. But as far as I remember, I think there are two attitudes. One attitude is if two of the reservations are exactly the same, so you don't know what to do, then trace it. and make sure keys are lost between those stations. Same argument as with the inconsistency. One of the two is attacker. Delete the key. This could be one possibility. And probably this was a possibility we didn't do in the paper, if I remember it right. Second possibility is to say, hey, if two of these values or even more are the same, then of course we cannot guarantee collision freeness for those slots. Okay. Then those stations can't send. Okay. In some sense, this does not sound safe, because if an attacker could hinder some station from sending, maybe this is an avenue of attack, because he knows in this round one station can't send. I don't know. So what we did is, now let's see where I did write it down. I would argue that the kind of commitment we used once, we are using twice. So here I argued, here we have a commitment telling us whether it's a trap or not. And depending whether it's a trap or not, later on it is decided whether to investigate or not. And I could do the same trick once again at a lower level of the DC protocol. Usually in the DC network, maybe I go back. We said stations add up messages and keys, and then they send their message. I didn't argue whether this is first done by station 1, and then by 2, and then by 3, whether it's done by all 3 at absolutely the same time. So no way, or I didn't argue about that. By the way, it wouldn't be easy to enforce it. So if I would be an attacker, what could I do? I would wait until 2 of the 3 have output their sum, their local sum. And then I have an option to decide what my output as the attacker will be. And my output as the attacker determines then the global sum, right? So in such a scenario, the station sending last has some kind of advantage, because that station knows what the earlier stations did output. So if I want to disturb in some systematic way, I always would try to be slightly late and then determine my output. By the way, if you listen to discussions of human beings, a usual strategy is first, let's make everybody his arguments, and then try to be the last one pointing out how arguments contradict each other. This usually gives you a good position, a more powerful position. And for me, it's absolutely funny why politicians try to be the first ones giving their arguments. in any political talk on TV. If you would have a strong moderator who enforces that everybody gets a fair share of time, then always I would try to be the last one talking. But okay. So, can we do something against that? And the answer is yes. And the basic idea is a commitment scheme. What was the commitment scheme? The commitment scheme was I could commit to a value. The value is now committed to, it's fixed. But nobody of you knows to which value I did commit. And you could do the same. You could commit to a value. The value is now fixed. I have no clue to which value you did commit to. Nobody has a clue, except you. And this means if you go very fundamentalistic, and now it gets even more expensive, you would say, hey, stations don't output their local sum. What they output is a commitment for their local sum. And then they make sure they have all the commitments of the other stations. Now all the values are fixed. And now we are opening the commitments, one by one. Now the sequence, how commitments are opened, doesn't care. We don't care, because everything is fixed before the first commitment is opened. And now we are going to open all the commitments before doing anything else. And this means, with this procedure, we can prevent that the person deciding late about its value has some kind of advantage. Which means if now here values are the same, then it must be between stations which did attack, which did coordinate to have the same value. Otherwise, it's really improbable, which gives us different strategies to punish at this point here the same values. So if it happens too often, just kick out those stations from the network. So what is the message to be learned until here? The message is, first, sender anonymity and the possibility to jam the network in the DC network are closely related. It's kind of dual to each other. If you can send anonymously in an additive network, you can jam it anonymously. First statement. Second statement, if we take some expense, and it's complicated protocols, it's really expensive, we can make sure that in the long run, jamming the network will be punished, which hopefully discourages jamming the network. Third, the protocols we have are now, I would say, somehow tricky. There surely are different versions. And I wouldn't argue, hey, there's one best protocol to achieve it. We had several versions. Depending on how strong you feel your attacker is, the more expensive your protocol gets. I can't say this is better than that, because this is more expensive. Maybe it's more secure, but it's more expensive. Do we really need the expense? Therefore, I would assume that we only start the expensive protocols if you really need them. So let's start with an optimistic variant first. By the way, in my group, we are, during those weeks, just implementing the DC Plus network for large-scale deployment. So we want to do experiments with larger groups of people, whether this works that way, and positioning that as an extension of the unknown system. Because within the DC network, by the way, there's no useful possibility to do data retention, because what data should you retain? Or the local outputs? I would say that's ridiculous. What else could you retain? The message here, but according to German law, this is not okay, because it would force you to say something against yourself. The keys, if you retain them and the output is known, the key values tell whether you did send something. Again, you would have to say something against yourself, which is nothing you can enforce in Germany. So in some sense, we are just doing this kind of implementation because we strongly feel that this is a system which is secure against, at least in Germany, any laws with respect to data retention. But let's see. Maybe I'm not a lawyer, but as far as I see, I would argue that way. And if we do that kind of experiment, of course, we will learn how complicated protocols we really need. Of course, in our implementation, we start with the simple ones. But I push that even the complicated ones we are going to implement, just to have them in case we need them. So I think we are pretty close to the end of the DC network slides. Until here, I really talked about attacks. Hopefully we won't have attacks, then we can start with simpler protocols. But we have a kind of security which can stand really clever modifying attacks. Of course, in real life, if things go wrong, it's not always an attack. Often things go wrong because of some kind of misunderstanding, if it's between human beings, or because just some computers or electronic devices had some kind of fault or failure. So what to do? If it's about errors, and if it's not about attacks. Because handling errors could be much more efficient than handling attacks. Why? Errors are somehow stupid. You can make maybe some assumptions about errors. Okay, one way to do it is now handling errors, that is talking about fault tolerance, that we have two modes of operation. An anonymity mode and a fault tolerant mode. I call it A mode and F mode. So in A mode, we just do anonymous transmission of messages using superposed sending. if something goes wrong, if a fault is detected, then we switch from A mode to F mode. In F mode, no sending of sensitive information. We do some kind of fault localization, that is, which computer did break down. We will take defective components out of operation. We will then go back to A mode by reinitializing the pseudo-random generators and reinitializing the access protocol. And then we can just continue. That is, if you're talking about errors, we can just switch between the two modes. Of course, this would never ever help against modifying attacks, because everybody knows in which mode we are. So an attacker would not misbehave here. So you couldn't do a diagnosis which station was wrong, and an attacker would only disturb here in A mode. So one way to do fault tolerance. A second way to do fault tolerance is to say, let's assume we have many, many, many DC networks. And if you look at this, we have a particular kind of interconnection structure such that those dots mean we have write and read access to the DC network. And without a dot, it means we have just read access to the DC network. So what do we have here? We have a DC network 1, where stations 1, 2, 3, and 4 have write access, but all others have read access. So what is DC network 1? It's a network which has less sender anonymity than a DC network comprising all the stations 1, 2 through 10 would have. Because here in this DC network, it's only 4 stations which can send. So sender anonymity is decreased. In network 2, it's station 1, 5, 6, 7. Again, it's 4 stations which can send, and so on. And now, if you look what might happen, let's assume station 3 misbehaves. It runs havoc. It just doing a denial of service attack against all the networks that station is connected to, including write access. That is, station 3 can bring down network 1, and it can bring down network 4, right? Is this a problem? I would argue until here it's not a problem, because all other stations still have a DC network they can use for sending. Station 1 can send on DC network 2. Station 2 can send on DC network 3. Of course, station 3 can't send because it's just bringing down all the networks it's connected to. Station 4 can send on network 5. Station 5 can send on both networks, fine. Station 6 can send on network 2. Station 7 on networks 2 and 5. 8 on the network 3. 9 on the networks 3 and 5. And station 10 can send on network 5. So this is a kind of error correcting or error tolerating coding done with respect to who or which station can send on which DC network. And this code is tolerating one station. one station running havoc. If you take a second station running havoc, then there will be stations which are okay, but which can't send anymore. So I did choose here stations 3 and 5, such that here it's 1 and 4, and here it's 2 and 3. So 2 stations can bring down 4 networks. So it's only DC network 5 which is still functioning, which means, of course, that station 1 can't send, station 2 can't send, 4 can, 6 can't, 7 can, 8 can't, 9 can, 10 can. So this would be a configuration. Station 3 and 4, sorry, stations 3 and 5 running havoc, which would hinder some other stations from sending. And I think this is everything I wanted to say about the DC network. So do you have questions? So just keep in mind those last slides. It's only about errors. It's not about clever attacks. Of course, you could argue if the interconnection here is given that way, okay, it's even preventing against an attack of station 3. But surely this kind of code wouldn't protect against a coordinated attack of 3 and 5.